Welcome to Cloud Developer channel. In today's video, we're going to complete the topic around ASP.NET MVC Core cookies as well as user session information. And just to do a quick recap, in the prior videos, what we've done is we built an ASP.NET MVC Core application that we can host inside of our 5-node Service Fabric cluster. That ASP.NET MVC Core application is actually a stateless application service. And what that means is that the user can actually send a request to any of 5 of the nodes without having to care how to retrieve the session information. And our application is going to be able to allow the user to log in. And then what we've done is we actually built a session keys stateful service, which allows us to actually have any one of our nodes in Service Fabric to be able to decrypt that cookie information that is stored in a browser and is coming in as part of the request. And using that cookie information, we're now allowing the user to authenticate in a load balanced manner and a reliable manner. So in case our Service Fabric cluster gets upgraded and any of the nodes actually go down, the user won't actually know that something happened because any one of the other nodes in the cluster will be able to answer that request. And the last part that we're going to complete with this particular application is going to be building a way for us to store user session information. So once the user actually logs in, now we can identify the user. We want to be able to store information about that user session. So let's say a user actually has profile settings that we want to keep track of, or maybe they click the button to add something to the cart, or they've done something inside of your application which you typically would want to store in your session. In this particular case, what we're going to do is we're going to store it inside of another service. It's called a reliable actor, and that's going to act as our basically our database backend for the user session information, as well as being very reliable also. So what we're going to start off with is we're going to add this actor service, and then we're going to create all of the necessary APIs and classes in order to integrate it into our ASP.NET MVC application. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create this reliable actor. So we right click on our application, we go to add, and then we're going to add a new service. I'm going to go ahead and choose this actor service, and I'll call this SF contacts.user session. Once actually it creates this particular actor service, it's going to call it user session actor service. Now the class itself is actually user session, but what we'll see is the actual service name is going to be slightly different. So that's also important to remember. So the other thing you'll notice is that when you create the user session project itself, or in this case a reliable actor service, it actually creates 2 projects. One is to contain your class, the other one is for the interfaces. So similar to what we've done in the session keys case, where we actually created the domain project, in this case it creates an interfaces class to contain your interface for this particular actor service. So once it created it, let's go ahead and actually open this user session interface, and we can go ahead and delete this boilerplate content. And what we're going to do is we're going to add some methods in here. So there's going to be 3 methods that we're going to be adding to it, and they're going to give us the ability to get information from this particular service, set information, or add, and then also be able to remove. So it's pretty straightforward. Basically, we'll have a task that returns a string. So get session item is going to be the name. We're going to pass in the key, and this is going to be used to retrieve information about the user session. And then cancellation token for threading and asynchronous operations. Then the set session item is basically going to be used in order to set or add values to our user session. So instead of actually calling it add and then having another one for update, I'll call it set. In this case, if it doesn't find something, it will actually go ahead and add it to the session. So it's going to take in a key and as well as the value. So it's going to be storing things using a string. and then also pass in the cancellation token. And then the last one is going to be the remove session, which takes in a key, and that's it. So let's go back to then our user session class. And in this class, we're going to go ahead and remove this boilerplate code as well for activate async all the way down, just to clean it up a little bit. And then we're going to go ahead and implement the interface. And this is going to give us those three methods. So let's do some copy and pasting real quick. And these methods are pretty straightforward, actually. So the first one is going to be the get session item. And in this particular method, what we're going to do is we're going to use the state manager. So let me actually type this out instead of copy and pasting it, just so I can explain it a little bit better. So first thing you want to do is you want to mark these as async. This will give us the ability to use the asynchronous methods using the await keywords. So, and we're going to actually add this to the get session item as well as the remove session item methods. And we don't need to actually do it on a set session item because we're not using the await key inside of the method. So let's start with the get session item first. The first step we're going to take is we're going to actually make a call to the state service to say, go ahead and try to get the value from the state management store. So, and we do that by declaring a variable first, and we'll call it state value, and we'll say await state manager, and then we'll say try get state async, and it's going to be of type string since we're returning strings. And then we're going to pass it a key and cancellation token. So what this is doing is actually it's trying to retrieve that particular state object or that value that somebody might have attempted to store. If it doesn't find it, we'll actually be able to interrogate the results or the response that we got from this method to respond back to the caller of this get session item method, either with a particular value or some kind of a failure. So in this particular case, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be checking, does this state value have a value? So in this case, just so we don't try to return or we can do some kind of validation if we wanted to. So, but all we're doing in this case is we're checking, does it have a value? And if it does have a value, then go ahead and return the value property. Otherwise, we're just going to return null. So now you can do more validation if you wanted to. So then the next item is going to be our remove session item. So inside of a remove session item, what we're going to do is we're going to simply await, and we're going to say state manager and try remove. So we don't really need to do any kind of validation in this case. So all we're doing is just saying, try to execute this method, try to remove based on a key, and we'll pass it the key and cancellation token, and everything should work. Now, if the key doesn't actually exist, it should not fail. So, and last but not least, what we're going to do is we're going to actually try to update the value inside of our state manager or try to add that. And the way you would do that is you would simply return and then call state manager and add or update. So in this particular case, if it already exists, it will simply try to update the value. If it doesn't exist, it will add it to the state. So let's go ahead and actually populate the arguments. So in this case, we're going to pass in the key that we're going to want to store, the value. And then this is kind of the comparison logic to check to see if it should update it or not. In this particular case, all we're doing is we're just basically saying, go ahead and store the value. Don't try to do any kind of comparison. Just take in the value and store it anyway. And then we're going to say, the cancellation token that the user passed in from before in the argument, and we're done. So this makes it very easy. Now, what you could also do is instead of just allowing somebody to store a string, you could also create another object that is marked as serializable, and then you can store more complex objects than just strings. But I'm following a basic pattern of storing string information just like you would in a normal, maybe SQL based session store. So if you want to get more complicated, you can always upgrade this particular service to actually handle the scenarios. Important thing to note about reliable actors is you cannot use generics in order to pass in and store information. It will actually complain, at least in the current release that I'm using. So I'll go ahead and finish up here. So in this particular case, we're actually done with the user session actor service. And the next step what we're going to do is we're going to move on to our application itself. So the ASP.NET MVC application. And what we're going to do first is we're going to actually add an interface. And this interface is going to be for our service, or in some cases people call them repositories if you're actually interacting with a database, but I like to call them services in my case. So, and I'll call this ISessionService. And this ISessionService is gonna allow my ASP.NET MVC application to wrap the logic around the actual user service or the user session actor service itself. So let's go ahead and actually copy some methods into this interface, and it's going to basically have two methods. Now I could also add the remove logic as well, but for the purpose of the demo I think this is sufficient, and if you wanted to you can also add it and see if you can actually get it to work. So all I'm doing here is basically allowing the user to call the add session item, and in this case I can use generics, and I'm passing in the key and the user can pass in the value. And then get session item, you basically pass in a key and you tell it the type you want to return, and that's pretty much it. And now what we're going to do is we're going to create a class, and this class is going to implement this interface. So let's do that real quick. And in this particular class, this is actually an interesting class to have, because it's going to do a few different things. One is it's going to give us an abstraction layer to our user session actor service. And another thing is it's going to actually interact with our HTTP context, or the request that is coming in, so that it can obtain the information about the user session. So, and the way we're going to do that is we're going to create a constructor, and this constructor is actually going to accept an argument called IHTTP context accessor. And what this is a way for us to be able to inject HTTP context object for each request that comes in into this session service, and this session service will actually be created for each request and pass in the actual context object all the time. So, and what we're going to do here is we're going to actually create a property called HTTP context, and we're going to set the context accessor and HTTP context. Now we're going to do a couple more things here. First of all, I'm going to make sure that it's not null, and if it's not null, it's going to try to retrieve the HTTP context. Now if it is null, we're going to throw a new argument exception, and what we're going to say is context accessor .HTTP context is null, just to let the consumer of our service know that they passed in something that we couldn't access, and this is actually required, so it's a good thing to check. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to reuse what's called a service URI builder. It's something we built in our prior video, which allows us to simplify how we build the Service Fabric URL to other services. So what we're going to do is we're going to call it user session URI builder, and we're going to initialize it, and it's the actual class name is service URI builder. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass in the name of our service, and that's going to be user session actor service. And once we actually initialize it, we can actually use it throughout our class. But first, we actually need to generate some properties so we can actually access these. I'm going to go ahead and remove them from being public. And now we want to actually start implementing some interfaces. So we're going to implement our interface that we created before. So let's rearrange these a little bit. So we have two methods specifically that we want to implement: the add session item and get session item. There's also another thing that we want to implement, which is a helper property, and it's going to allow us to actually retrieve the session information actor itself. So it's pretty straightforward. Let me show you. I'll just copy and paste some code here. So the first thing we're going to do is here we actually are going to be referencing our user session, and in order to do that, we actually want to add the reference to our project that we've created, which is the sfcontext.usersession.interfaces. So I'll go ahead and do that here. And then what you'll see is we're basically creating a getter, and inside of that getter, what it's doing is it's trying to retrieve the user session information. Now, we don't actually have this method, which I'm going to show you in a moment. And then we're checking to see if it's empty, then we just return null for the iUser session instance. Now, if it's not empty, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new class that's actually called actor ID. This is actually something that's part of another library that we're going to need to add to this project. And we pass in that user session ID. That's going to be the identifier for our actor service. That's how Service Fabric knows which instance you're going to be accessing and where the information is stored. And then we're going to call actor proxy, which is also stored inside of that additional library. And it's going to pass in the actual interface to that user session actor service. And then what we're going to be doing here is actually using our URI builder. That's the user session URI builder. And what we'll do here is call to URI. So this is sufficient enough to actually create that particular iUser session actor service, and we're going to return it and consume it inside of our methods. So let's do a couple of things here. So first of all, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to add this additional Nougat library. So we're going to right click on dependencies, manage Nougat packages, click on browse, and we're going to search for Microsoft.Service Fabric. So, and then if you actually scroll down, you'll see that there's a library called Microsoft.ServiceFabric.actors. Now, in my case, I'm actually now using an older version since Microsoft released a newer version, and specifically the version of the library I'm going to be using is 2.7.198. If you have a newer version of Service Fabric, I would encourage you to actually use the appropriate version for your needs. So, but in my case, I'm going to be using this 2.7.198. Go ahead and install it. Accept the licensing agreement. And once it completes, I'll be able to go ahead and make the necessary changes in my application. So now I'll click on this actor ID, and I'll click on this icon and add this using statement. And also click on this actor proxy, and that's another class that's available, and I'll just add the using statement for that as well. So it completed or fixed these two lines. Now, the thing that's still missing is this get user session ID. So let's go ahead and actually add this method. And in my case, it actually creates a wrong signature because I want to return a string. And let's actually implement this method. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be retrieving information about the user session. So, and what we want to do is look for a specific, what's called a claim with a value in it to identify that user session. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask HTTP context.user.claims for a list of those claims, and then go through each one and find the particular one we're interested in. So what we're going to do is declare a variable, call it claim enumerator, and we'll access the HTTP context through the property that we injected. And then we're going to say user.claims and then get enumerator. So once we have the enumerator, we'll declare a string that's going to be user session ID, and we'll mark it as null, and we'll actually return the user session ID. But we want to actually try to discover it inside of a request. So first of all, we're going to do here is we're going to say while user session, or actually claim enumerator, move next, and this allows us to actually enumerate through the list of claims. And we're going to check to see if a particular string equals. So what we're looking for is a specific claim type. So in this particular case, we're going to say if claim enumerator.current, which is the one that we're iterating over right now, and then type, so claim type, and if it equals claim types, and let's import the actual user statement where the claim types are defined, and we're going to look for a name identifier. And also we're going to specify the type of comparison we're going to be doing, which is invariant culture. And then we're going to want to care about the casing. Now you could also specify ignore case, but since we're going to be using this claim types name identifier, we know that the actual key that we're looking for is always going to be the same. So in this case, basically, if we find that the claim type that we're currently enumerating matches the name identifier, what we're going to do is we're going to say user session ID equals claim enumerator dot current dot value. So we're going to take the value for that given claim and store it inside of this local variable, and then we're going to break out of the loop. And as soon as it breaks out of the loop, it will go to this return statement and return that value. Now, if it never found the particular claim type in the case of the user never logged in, then it basically will return null. So as you can see where it's being used here, we'll be able to actually get the user session if it exists. And then if it's null, then it returns null. Otherwise, it will actually try to create an actor ID and try to generate the instance of the actor proxy for the ISession actor service. Now, the way it works is if you actually have an actor with that user session ID already specified with the same session ID, it will basically create you this actor proxy to that same actor, and you'll be able to retrieve all the information within that actor service. If it doesn't find one, however, it will create a new instance of an actor and start storing all the information. So this is a pretty easy way for you to be able to initiate basically different sessions as you need them. Now, you might need to actually build logic to go ahead and clean up and make sure that those actors don't hang around all the time, and you want to actually clean them up periodically. So in this case, those methods are done, and now all we need to do is basically implement logic inside of our add session item and get session item. So let's do that real quick. So basically, we're going to start off with adding a try-catch statement, just so we can actually make sure that if we actually do have a failure, that the consumer of this session service doesn't really need to worry about what the failure was. We'll go ahead and log it and return a null value or something that doesn't cause the application to break. And inside of this method here, what we're going to do is we're going to we want to mark this as async, since we're going to be using an await keyword. And here we'll say await session actor. We'll do a question mark to make sure that it's not null, because it can be null, and if it's null, then we don't want to actually execute any additional logic. And then we're going to say set session item. And we're going to pass in the key, and then we're going to pass in value to string, and then we're going to specify the cancellation token. And we're going to go ahead and add the system threading namespace and specify none as the actual value. And that should be it. Now, what we also want to do is inside of a try-catch statement, we'll actually want to log this information. So we're using the session service event source current message, and what we're doing is we're basically saying inside of the session service, which is the service we're building, a method called add session item was called, and it failed with a given error, and that's where we're actually getting the exception and calling to string on it, and we're also going to log the time frame that the message occurred or that particular call was made. So that's pretty much it for the implementation of the add session item. and then we're going to do something similar for the get session item. So in this case, again, we're going to do a try catch statement. We're going to actually, let's go ahead and copy and paste the logging logic. And this is pretty much the same as the one above, except the method name is different. And here, what we're going to want to do is actually some validation, because we need to actually return a particular type of an object. So we're going to have to do some type conversion. So let's do this. We're going to create a variable called a session item value, and we're going to say, actually, we need to use mark it as async as well, because we're using an await keyword for asynchronous logic. And then we're going to say session actor question mark in case it's null, get session item, and then here then we're going to pass in key and cancellation token of none. And so now we actually potentially retrieve the actual value for that given session, for that user session for that given key. Now that's not enough, because we need to actually return a specific type. So let's first check to see if it's null, and we do that by doing string as null or empty, session item value. And if it is null, what we're going to do is we're going to just return default of t. So this is a way of using generics. So basically, if it's a string, it will return null. If it's a specific enum, I'll actually return a specific default value for that given enum, and so on. So, but if it wasn't null, then what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to actually cast that to a specific type that the user is passing. And the way you do that is by casting that type and also calling convert change type. We're going to pass in the session item value and then the type that we want to convert it to. So, and this should actually return that, or change that session item value to that particular type. Now, also at the end, we're going to want to return default of t in case one of these conditions wasn't met and we actually get to the end of the method. So this is it for the implementation of this particular wrapper session service. Now, the time is to actually implement logic to consume this session service, and let's take a look at how to do that. So in order to make this usable, what we need to do is we need to actually make the ASP.NET MVC Core application know that when somebody asks for ISessionService, that we're going to actually return the session service class instance. So, and the way you do that is you go to the startup.cs, and inside of your configure services method, we're going to add that service to our dependency framework. So we'll call services.add scoped. Now, this is important. The add scoped is actually used to create services or classes for the entire lifetime of that given request, which is, basically once a screen got rendered for the user for that given request, all of the service instances will actually be disposed of that are scoped, and then a new instance will actually be created. In the case where you want to use singletons, where basically they will live for the duration of the application, you want to use add singleton. And then there's another method that can be used to say anytime that anybody requests a service, it will create a new instance of that service for you all the time. So in this case, I'm using scoped because I want it for the duration of the entire request. So I'll call this ISessionService, and we're going to return a session service object. So, and this was enough to actually make the application aware. Now, this actually does two things. If you remember, in our session service, we actually are asking to make sure we get this IHTTP context accessor. Now, this dependency injection framework will actually automatically know to inject this as part of the dependency injection logic inside of your ASP.NET MVC Core application. So now that we've set it up, the last step is to actually add some logic inside of our account controller to be able to add the additional claim. And we already had logic inside of our login method, and we were already adding a username. Now we're going to want to add a new claim, and this claim is actually going to be that name identifier. And what we're going to add here is actually a new GUID. And basically this is going to represent that given user session, and we're going to want to pass it in as a string, and that's it for this. Now another thing that I want to actually add for the purpose of the demo is the ability to store the actual cookie information, so that in case the user actually closes the browser session and reopens it, the cookie doesn't actually get destroyed. And in order to do that, you have to actually set a property. Typically, the way it's done is, if you remember, in some applications, you actually have a checkbox to say "Remember my session." Now, I don't have that built in my application, but I'm going to hard code it here for the purpose of the demo. And all you have to do in order to support that is, inside of your sign in async method, you just add a third argument, which is basically a property, authentication property. And in here, there's a property called isPersistent, and you set it to true. And in case if you actually have a checkbox, you can check to see if the user checked it, and then just pass in the appropriate value here. But in this case, I'm just going to hard code it. So that's all we needed in order to add or tie that entire piece of logic to now be able to identify a user session and allow our active service to become usable. And we can now leverage our ISessionService. Now, how do we actually use this? Now, when the user actually clicks login in our application and we successfully log in, we're actually going to redirect the user to our profile page, and specifically the index page. What we're going to do is we're going to go to our profile controller, and in here we're going to now actually add some logic to consume that ISessionService. So the way to do that is we'll actually create a constructor, and in here all we're going to do is just specify ISessionService and call it ISessionService, and then we're going to generate a property. And this property is actually going to also be checked to make sure it's not null. And it added at the bottom here. We're just going to go ahead and organize it a little bit better. Remove the public keyword, so it's only consumable from within the controller. And that's all we had to do. And dependency injector will actually automatically create that instance of the service and make it fully accessible to us in this particular class. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to actually add a value that we know about. Now, you can actually use it for other purposes, but just to kind of show you what I'm going to do is I'm going to generate a new session key item that's going to be stored inside of our user session active service, and it's just going to be the username. But you can store whatever information you'd like that is helpful throughout your application once the user logs in. So what we're going to do first is we're going to check to see if the key doesn't already exist, and if it doesn't, then we'll go ahead and add it. So it's pretty straightforward. Basically, if string is null or empty, and we're going to say await because it's async implementation, session service, get session item, and it's of type string, and we're gonna assume that the user is actually, we're going to be storing the username itself. So let's check for the username. So if it's null or empty, we're going to go ahead and actually store that information. If it's not null or empty, we're going to basically ignore it and not execute anything. So all we have to do now is call session service dot add session item, and what we're going to do is pass in the actual key, which is going to be username, and we're going to say http context dot user dot identity and name, and that's basically the username that the user used. So that's all we needed to do here. Let's see. And we'll add the await keyword as well. So now it actually added this information, and we have it available to consume. So what we're going to do as the last step is actually go to our home controller, and let's actually add this logic so we can display it to the user on the home screen in case the user actually logged in. And if you remember in a prior video, we only had some sensitive information showing up on a profile screen, but that's because that's where we wanted it. Now that we actually have logic to have this reliable active service, we can also show the information in other parts of our application pretty easily as well. So let's go ahead and add a constructor. And again, we'll add the ISessionService. And we'll go ahead and initialize the property as well as add a null check. And we'll move this to the bottom of this class and remove the public accessor. And the other thing we'll do is we'll add some data to our view data, so it's accessible to our view that we're going to display the user information. So we'll populate the current username, and we'll say session service dot get session item string username. So basically, if this particular value exists, it will be available in our view. Now let's go back to our actual view, the index view inside of our home folder. And what we'll do here is we'll actually populate a variable called current username. And we'll make sure it's casted as string. And then what we're going to do here is we're actually going to copy and paste this, but we're going to do it inside of an if clause. So if it's not string is null or empty, which is we're going to be checking the current username. So if it's not null or empty, we're going to render it out to the screen. So let's clean this up a little bit. So because the only thing we care about rendering here is the current username. And we're going to render out the actual current username. So let's go ahead and try to run this and validate it on our local cluster, and then we'll go ahead and publish it to our 5-node cluster and make sure that it works there as well. Okay, so as you can see, the application started, and we have this session ID showing up on our homepage, but as you can see, we don't actually see any of the details about the currently logged in user because we haven't actually logged in. So when we hit profile, we can see the cookies that are generated, but we don't see any of the protection keys that we will be listing once the user logs in. And then we can go to contacts and about. So let's go back to profile and try to log in. Now you can see that the current user that we were rendering before shows up, the current claim shows up here, the cookies show up, and now the protection keys show up. Now let's go to our homepage and see if it works. So let's take a look to see why this is actually not working. Okay, so I had some trouble trying to actually get my local Service Fabric node to actually work correctly. So I had to restart it, clean it up a little bit, and it should be working now. So basically, the problem that I think I ran into before, where nothing was showing up on the homepage, is because I needed to make sure that I have the await keyword inside of the index action. Otherwise, it would not actually complete the request. It would actually not wait for the request to actually come back and complete. It would just simply kick off the request and assume that it was actually done, which is why you want to have the await keyword inside of asynchronous implementation. So now that the application is actually deploying, we should be able to actually do a quick test and make sure everything is working. So let's go ahead and click the home button and see that everything is working the way we needed it to. So in this particular case, let me actually make sure I don't have a breakpoint, because Visual Studio apparently doesn't like when you try to have a breakpoint and then try to execute it from there. Make sure it deploys again. So as you can see, the application started, and if we go to profile, we're being asked to log in. So let's go ahead and log in, and it takes us to the home page. And then when we hit home, now we can actually see the currently logged in user. So it's working within our application, and then if we actually go ahead and close the browser and start up a new session, you can actually see that even though we close the browser completely, we still see the actual details of who's currently logged in. So, and that's working because our session state is actually being stored inside of a reliable actor, and the way we can actually get to that actor is because we still have the cookie that is being decrypted, and the name identifier is being stored inside of the session cookie claim object. So if we actually click logout, now we lose that ID, and when we go to home page, we don't see that information anymore. So we had to log in, and we logged in as a different user, so you can actually see that the information is coming back correctly as well. So now all we have to do is actually go ahead and stop this, and go ahead and actually deploy to our 5-node fabric cluster, and make sure it's working correctly there. So let's go ahead and publish it. I'll choose my 5-node cluster, and let me actually open up that environment real quick. And you can see the difference being is that I'm actually pointing to a different cluster, and I currently don't have any applications running. You'll see that I have 5 nodes here, and there's no applications there either. And let's go ahead and hit publish and give it a moment, and it should show up, and we should be able to actually make sure that the UI application itself is actually scaled out across all 5 nodes. The actual session keys is only going to be deployed to 3 nodes, as well as our actor service is going to be deployed to 3 nodes. And everything should be working together just like it was on a local single node cluster. So you can see that our application is starting up, and you can see that the user session service, actor service itself, is actually living on all these partitions. The actual UI application is only deployed to 2 nodes, so let's go ahead and scale it out to 5. And our session keys is only living on 3 nodes, so that shouldn't be a problem for us. Let's actually go ahead and open up a new tab, and we'll navigate to our application using the URL for that 5-node cluster. You can see that I'm currently on dev SF4, which is one of the nodes, and then I'll cycle through some of the nodes to make sure it actually starts up on all of the nodes. So as you can see, as I'm cycling through, I'm hitting node 1, 3, 0, and 4, and 2 shows up as well. So now I basically pretty much hit every single node. And if I try to head home, one thing you'll notice is that the session ID keeps rotating. That's one thing that puzzled me for a while, and that's because I'm actually hitting different nodes in the cluster, and each node that I land on, because this is a stateless service from my ASP.NET MVC Core application, it actually generates a different session ID for each one. So I wasn't able to actually share the session information within each node. That's why using an actor service for something like this actually makes sense for me. So now if I hit profile, and let's say I go ahead and log in, you can see that when I click home, I can actually see the information about the currently logged in user. If I hit home again, it actually gets me to a different node, the session ID actually changes. But in this particular case, because I'm using cookies and that claim that we added, I'm able to actually reach out to a reliable actor in a way that is persistent for that given user and retrieve the information for that user session. So, and everything is working the way it that I expected it to work. Now, if I go ahead and close this browser and reopen it and go back to that URL, everything is still working. Now, let me go ahead and log out and show you something a little bit different. So if I actually go ahead and start the incognito mode or the private mode using Chrome, and let me actually open up private mode using IE and navigate to the same application. Now in IE, for some reason it's deciding to default to a different version of the browsers, which makes it look pretty bad because it doesn't load all the libraries. But when I force it to go to 11, everything is working. So you can see that the actual nodes that I'm hitting are the same, but the session ID is actually different. And when I try to go to profile here and profile here, you'll actually notice that it's using different information. So if I log in with dev test here and test here and click on home, you'll see that I'm actually logged in as two different users. So I know that everything is working this way as well. So all of the session information is being only shared for that given session of that given user. So if you have different versions or different instances of browsers running, then you'll be able to actually do some quick level validation. So everything is working perfectly, and if I actually start restarting nodes in the backend, the user won't even know that that's happening, and their session information is being persisted in a reliable manner and replicated way as well. So hopefully this was useful. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave your comments in the comment section below, and I will try to respond as quickly as I can. And in future videos, what I'm going to try to do is actually do some load testing by setting up a Visual Studio load testing environment and trying to hit these 5 nodes inside of a Service Fabric cluster and put as much load as I can on them to see what the actual thresholds are. So I've been able to actually achieve roughly 22 to 2300 requests per second from a single computer hitting this cluster. Now that's I would say is pretty robust implementation for such a I guess a simple setup of a cluster, and it was only putting about 2 to 4% load on each node in a cluster. So there's quite a ways to go, and I'm going to try to see if I can actually simulate a true workload, and then eventually get to a point where it can actually also communicate using reliable actors as part of that load testing as well. But I need to figure out how to actually inject the cookies in a way across all the different user sessions. So once I get that up and running, I'll record a video and we'll post it as well. So as well as how to actually set up the Visual Studio load testing environment. So I will look forward to posting those videos. If you have any comments, go ahead and leave them in the comment section below, and I will talk to you next time.